Okay, picture this. You're standing at maybe a chaotic intersection in a city you've never been to.
Yeah.
Maybe you pull out a map app, and it's just this dizzying amount of detail, right? Every street, every alley, one-way signs, bike lanes, bus stops.
Oh, yeah. Points of interest, statues.
Yeah,
It's totally overwhelming.
it is. But somehow you look at it, you orient yourself, and you figure out which way to go. You actually build a plan.
And that's the amazing thing about human planning, isn't it? We are just bombarded with information, but we manage to navigate all that complexity without getting completely bogged down in everything.
Exactly, because our brains just can't possibly build some giant decision tree considering every single route, every obstacle, every little piece of information on that map.
Nope, it's computationally impossible. We just don't have the cognitive bandwidth for that.
Right. So the big question has always been, how do we do it? There's this established idea, a framework called value-guided construal, or VGC.
VGC, yeah. It suggests we cope by building simplified mental representations. So instead of planning over that whole messy map, we kind of focus on a useful subset of information.
Like just the main streets or the subway stops, maybe.
Exactly. VGC proposes we try to pick information that's, valuable for the task, but also keeps the mental map relatively simple. It's a balance.
Okay, so VGC gives us the sort of ideal blueprint for a simplified map. It tells us what information should be relevant based on its value.
Right. But here's the crucial piece, the puzzle that's been around for a while. VGC didn't really explain how our brain actually builds that simplified map from all the overwhelming stuff coming in.
What are the actual cognitive mechanisms, the gears turning that take the entire world and boil it down to the few things we actually consider when we plan?
And that is precisely where this study comes in. This is the really significant academic innovation from Silva, Castanheira, Shea, and Fleming. They specifically dug into the how. They explored the fundamental role of attention and perception in actually shaping these simplified planning representations. It's a fantastic step because it connects those high-level planning theories with the nuts and bolts of how our brain's filtering systems actually work.
So our mission for this deep dive, then, is to unpack this study using the sources you've shared. We'll guide you through their, frankly, ingenious experiments and the surprising findings.
Yeah, findings that show attention isn't just about seeing things clearly. It acts more like a powerful spotlight, sometimes a bit biased, that fundamentally determines what information even makes it onto the mental map we use for planning.
Okay, let's dive in and see how this attentional spotlight illuminates our internal world of planning.
All right.
Okay, so how do they actually put this attentional spotlight idea to the test?
Well, they use a pretty classic cognitive science tool. Participants navigating 2D virtual mazes. Think simple grid worlds on a computer screen.
Right, like Pac-Man without the ghosts. You move an avatar from a start point to a goal, avoiding obstacles scattered around.
Exactly. But the really clever part, the key insight, is what they did after the navigation.
Okay.
Instead of just looking at, say, how fast people were or how optimal their path was, they asked them to report their awareness of specific obstacles they encountered. Did you notice this one? Did you see that one?
Ah, so they're trying to get inside the person's head.
Precisely. The researchers treated these awareness reports as a direct window into the participants' simplified task representation. Basically, what obstacles actually made it onto their internal conscious map of the maze, the map they were using to plan their moves.
Got it. So the awareness reports are the proxy, the readout for that simplified mental map. And I see they didn't just run one new experiment.
No, that's right. They were thorough. They reanalyzed data from a couple of previous maze studies, HO1 and 2, and then designed a brand new experiment, DSC1, specifically to probe these attention questions more deeply.
Using multiple data sets like that really strengthens the findings, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It gives you much more confidence that these aren't just one-off quirks of a single experiment, but, consistent cognitive effects.
Okay, so they have this set up to see what information gets included in the mental map. What was the first big hypothesis about attention's role?
Well, building on the basic idea that attention has a limited spatial focus, like a spotlight, they predicted that where your attention is shining would influence what makes it onto that map.
Makes sense.
And this led them to a really novel finding, something they termed attentional overspill.
Attentional overspill. Okay, tell me more. Sounds intriguing.
It really is, and it challenges that purely value-driven idea. The core finding was this. Participants were significantly more likely to be aware of an obstacle if it was spatially close to other obstacles they were already aware of.
Okay, so proximity matters.
Yes, but here's the twist. the part that deviates from a pure VGC model. This happened even if those nearby obstacles weren't actually relevant or valuable for finding the best path or avoiding critical dead ends. Their actual importance didn't matter as much as their closeness to something else the person noticed.
Whoa, hang on. So it's not just the importance of the obstacle itself, but whether it happens to live next door to other important obstacles.
Exactly. It's like the attentional spotlight, when it focuses on something relevant, isn't perfectly sharp. It illuminates a limited area around that focal point.
Like a beam with fuzzy edges.
Precisely. And anything caught within that sort of hazy boundary, whether it's useful for the plan or just, visual clutter, is more likely to spill over and make it into your conscious planning representation. The source even puts numbers on it, showing awareness is positively predicted by awareness of neighbors, with coefficients like 0.26, 0.29 for the closest ones.
Okay, that spotlight analogy really clicks now. The main beam hits the critical thing, but the diffuse edges accidentally light up nearby, maybe irrelevant stuff.
And the source notes this is conceptually pretty similar to well-known perceptual crowding effects in basic vision research.
Where having distractors close to a target makes it harder to perceive the target itself.
Exactly. And this study suggests a similar kind of mechanism. These fundamental limitations in our perceptual system are directly influencing how we build the higher-level cognitive structures we use for planning.
That's a really powerful connection. The original VGC model was great at predicting what you should ideally pay attention to based on pure value or relevance.
Right, the normative ideal.
But this study gives us a mechanistic demonstration of how the brain's actual architecture, the way attention works spatially, introduces deviations from that ideal. It shows spatial context, mediated by attention, biases the selection process. VGC alone didn't really account for that how.
And that empirical proof of how attention interacts with or even overrides pure value, that's a major academic contribution here. It grounds the theory in cognitive mechanics.
Super interesting. It's not just about abstract value, but physical location relative to other things you notice. What else did they find about how attention shapes this mental map?
Well, building on that spatial idea, they looked at another well-known feature of attention: lateralisation.
Okay, lateralisation.
Yeah.
That's about how our brain hemispheres handle information from different sides, right? Left visual field to the right brain, right visual field to the left brain.
Exactly. And often our attentional system can process information more efficiently if it's all presented unilaterally just on one side.
Right, like if everything you need to read is on the right page of a book, it feels easier than scanning back and forth constantly.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So the researchers reasoned, if attention is crucial for building these simplified representations, then maybe task-relevant information that was neatly organized and confined to one visual hemifield, left or right, should be easier for the brain to integrate.
Easier to integrate into what?
Into a representation that aligns well with the optimal VGC model's prediction. In other words, easier to build the ideal simplified map when the layout helps attention out.
Okay. So did they test that? How?
They did. They designed mazes where they could systematically vary how much of the truly task-relevant information was clustered on one side of an imaginary vertical line down the middle. They even created a lateralisation index to quantify this for each maze.
Clever. And what did they find?
The finding was pretty striking. They observed a significant moderation effect. The more the task-relevant information was lateralized across that vertical line,
The more it was grouped to one side.
the better the participants' actual awareness reports match what the original VGC model predicted they should be aware of for optimal planning.
Wow. Okay, so when the layout of the world taps into the brain's sort of preferred mode of attentional processing, keep the important stuff together on one side, we actually become more effective at building that ideal value-driven planning map.
That's exactly what it suggests. It shows that the inherent structure and biases of our attentional system don't just influence what gets in, like with the overspill,
Right.
but they can also facilitate the creation of a more optimal representation. When the information is presented in a way that attention handles efficiently, the resulting mental map is not only simplified, but also better aligned with what's genuinely valuable for the task.
That's a fantastic example of how these low-level perceptual mechanisms can constrain or even enable higher-level cognition like planning.
Yeah.
Did they find any nuances there? Was it always the case?
Well, there was a nuance. The effect was strongest and most consistent for vertical lateralization, comparing the left versus the right visual field.
Okay.
For horizontal lateralization, comparing the upper versus lower visual field, the effects were weaker and kind of inconsistent across the different data sets they looked at.
Any idea why?
The source suggests it could be due to specific features of their maze designs, or it might actually reflect fundamental differences in how our brains process information in the upper versus lower visual fields. That remains an interesting, open question for future research.
Fascinating. Okay, so we have spatial bleed, the overspill effect, and we have the layout of information, the lateralisation effect. Both show attention isn't just a passive recipient of value. Did everyone show these effects in the same way?
No, and this leads to another really crucial insight from the study. There was considerable inter-individual variation, as they put it.
People differed.
Yeah, quite a bit. For instance, some people showed much stronger attentional spillover effects than others. You could say their attentional spotlight seemed to have fuzzier or maybe wider edges.
Okay, so some people's attention is spillier than others.
You could put it that way, yeah. And they connected this variability to something they called the sparsity of the task representations.
Sparsity, what does that mean here?
They measured sparsity by looking at the variance in a participant's awareness reports across all the obstacles in a maze. High variance meant you were really aware of some obstacles, but completely oblivious to others. That's a sparse, very simplified, high-contrast map.
Got it. And low variance.
Low variance meant you had sort of moderate awareness of most things, a less sparse, maybe more detailed or cluttered map.
Okay, so a sparse map is one that's really boiled down, stripped to the essentials.
Exactly. And the correlation they found was quite telling, maybe even a little counterintuitive at first.
Which was?
Participants who showed larger attentional spillover effects, the spillier people, also tended to have sparser task representations overall. The source gives specific numbers, like a correlation coefficient of row unacted row inev at 0.35 across data sets.
Wait, so the people whose attention spills over the most onto nearby irrelevant stuff are also the ones who create the most focused, stripped-down mental maps. That feels backwards.
It does seem a bit odd at first, doesn't it? But one way to think about it, perhaps, is that maybe a stronger, more narrowly focused attentional beam, like a laser pointer, leads to more intense overspill right around the edges of that narrow focus compared to a broader, dimmer flashlight beam.
Okay.
And that tighter, more concentrated beam might also just result in ignoring a much larger proportion of the overall environment outside its path, leading naturally to a sparser representation of the whole task space.
Ah, okay, that makes more sense. Like a really bright spotlight, it illuminates its target intensely, maybe bleeds a bit right next to it, but leaves vast areas in total darkness.
Could be something like that. And this individual difference finding is really compelling because it starts to get at why you and I might tackle the same planning problem, say, organizing a complex project, and end up focusing on, or maybe even noticing, completely different aspects of the whole situation.
Yeah, it suggests these basic attentional biases, how spilly or focused our spotlight is, are fundamental to the unique way each of our brains constructs the world we then try to plan within.
Exactly. Our internal planning landscapes might be quite different.
This empirical evidence about how attention biases representation and how that varies between people is already a really significant contribution, moving beyond just the normative VGC. But I understand they didn't stop there. They built something new computationally.
They did, and this is another key part of their academic innovation. They didn't just observe these effects, they developed a new computational model specifically designed to capture them. They call it the Spotlight VGC model.
Okay, so it's an extension of the original VGC framework.
Exactly. The original VGC told us what's optimal based on value alone. The new Spotlight VGC model incorporates the mechanism they uncovered, that attentional spotlight spillover effect.
How does it work, in simple terms?
Basically, instead of just calculating an obstacle's relevance based purely on its own value for the plan, the Spotlight VGC model recalculates that relevance. It does this by taking a weighted average. It considers both the obstacle's own value and the values of its neighboring obstacles within a certain spatial distance.
So it mathematically blends in the neighbors.
Right. And based on their data analysis, they found that incorporating neighbors up to about 3 squares away in the grid provided the best fit to how people actually behave.
Okay, so let me see if I get this. If an obstacle should be important, according to pure VGC, but it's surrounded by a lot of irrelevant junk, this new model predicts it might actually be less likely to make it onto your mental map, because the spotlight calculation pulls in the low value of its neighbors.
Precisely. It gets dragged down by the neighborhood, you could say. And conversely, something maybe only moderately important on its own might get a relevance boost if it happens to be sitting right next to several highly critical obstacles.
Because the spotlight on the neighbor spills over onto it.
Exactly. It mathematically simulates that attentional overspill and
Yeah.
how it influences the apparent relevance of information, the relevance that actually makes it into consciousness.
And what was the result? Did this new model work better?
Yes, significantly better. This Spotlight VGC model provided a statistically better fit to the participants' actual awareness reports, their real, sometimes messy mental maps compared to the original, purely value-driven VGC model.
Interesting. Was it better everywhere or in specific situations?
Critically, the improvement was most pronounced in the more complex, non-lateralized maze scenarios.
Ah, the ones where the relevant information wasn't neatly grouped to one side.
Exactly. And that's important because those non-lateralized mazes are arguably more like the messy reality of everyday planning, right? Like planning that trip in a new city. The important stuff isn't always conveniently segregated for our attention.
True.
In those complex situations, the brain presumably has to work harder to filter information, and so the inherent biases of the attentional system, like the spatial spillover, become more prominent and influential. The Spotlight VGC model succeeds precisely because it explicitly accounts for these real-world mechanistic deviations from pure ideal rationality.
So the computational model provides a concrete how. It offers a mechanistic computational account of how attention guides the formation of these simplified representations.
Yes, and that's a core academic output here. It really bridges the gap between perceptual psychology, attention research, and computational theories of planning. It helps explain why our plans aren't always perfectly optimal in the VGC sense.
That really brings it all together nicely. It's not just observing these interesting effects, it's building a computational framework that explains how attention actively shapes our internal planning world.
Exactly. And the study also touches on something even broader, this fundamental link between attention, consciousness, and decision-making.
How does it speak to consciousness specifically?
Well, the authors argue, and it makes intuitive sense, that the kind of complex, multi-step forward planning needed in these mazes and, frankly, in navigating your day seems to rely heavily on conscious representations.
Why conscious? Why couldn't we just plan these complex routes unconsciously? Some things feel automatic.
Simpler actions might be, but they suggest conscious representations are kind of uniquely suited for complex forward planning. Why? Because consciousness seems to be where we integrate different types of information, sensory details, spatial locations, and abstract values or goals into a single, relatively stable, integrated picture.
Like bringing everything together onto one mental workspace.
Exactly. And that integrated view, available to your conscious awareness, seems necessary for simulating potential future paths, evaluating different outcomes over multiple steps, which is the essence of complex planning. Unconscious processes might be fast, but they often lack that integrated, stable quality needed for foresight and complex evaluation across domains.
So your conscious awareness of the maze layout, the obstacles, the paths, the integrated picture is the map you're consciously running simulations on in your head to decide where to go next.
That seems to be the argument. And the maze task, as simple as it might look, serves as what they call an ecologically valid probe.
Meaning it mimics real-world challenges.
In a simplified way, yes. It's a miniature model that lets researchers study these deep connections between attention, conscious awareness, and complex decision-making in a controlled setting, but one that still captures key aspects of real-world spatial navigation and planning. It's a clean way to see what actually makes it onto the map you consciously use.
And just as importantly, what gets left off that map.
Precisely, because attention didn't highlight it.
So, what are the big questions this study leaves unanswered? Where does this line of research go next?
Oh, there are several exciting avenues. First, they really need to nail down why horizontal lateralization didn't show the same clear effects as vertical. Is it just something about the specific mazes they used? Or is there a more fundamental difference in how our brain handles vertical versus horizontal space in this kind of planning task?
Vertical seems special for some reason in their data.
It does, yeah. Could be related to known visual field biases rooted in the cortex. Another big open question is about multiple spotlights.
Can we attend to more than one area at once for planning?
Maybe. Remember those individual differences, the link between more spillover and sparser maps. That hints that perhaps some people can divide their attention or maintain multiple attentional foci simultaneously during planning, perhaps leading to less sparse maps, while others rely more on a single, strong, but maybe spillover-prone spotlight.
Like being able to track two different routes or sets of obstacles at the same time.
Potentially, yeah. They also want to explore how attention moves or shifts dynamically during the planning process itself. Does it jump strategically between important points? Does it scan across areas? We don't know the dynamics yet.
And of course, the underlying brain activity, what's happening neurally.
Exactly. What are the specific neural mechanisms, the brain regions involved, and the precise timing of how attention biases information and shapes these conscious planning representations? Future work using neuroimaging like MEG or fMRI could look directly at brain activity while people are doing these tasks.
That would be fascinating.
And one last thing they note. This study relied on awareness reports given after the maze was done retrospective reports. Future research could try to probe awareness or attentional state more directly, maybe during the planning or navigation process itself, perhaps with eye tracking or other methods.
All crucial next steps for building a really complete picture of how we plan.
Definitely.
Okay, so bringing it back to where we started navigating that complex city map, we knew that humans simplify information to be able to plan it all.
Right. The VGC idea gave us the simplify based on value.
And this study gives us really novel, compelling empirical evidence, plus a computational model, demonstrating how that simplification process happens. It shows it's fundamentally guided, and sometimes biased, by the basic mechanisms of our attentional system.
It shows that planning isn't just some abstract calculation of information value. It's profoundly shaped by the physical properties of how we attend to and perceive the world, with attention acting like that spotlight, illuminating the simplified mental map we actually use for our decisions.
And the academic contribution really seems to be in bridging that gap, right, between the high-level theories of value-based planning and this sort of messy reality of human perception and attention.
Absolutely. It provides a plausible, testable, mechanistic explanation for why our actual planning might deviate from perfect rationality in predictable ways, and also helps account for why there are these individual differences in how we each build those internal maps.
So makes you think about your own planning today, doesn't it? Organizing your tasks, figuring out your commute, even deciding what groceries to buy. How might your own attentional spotlight be influencing what details you focus on?
Yeah, what information you prioritize, and maybe what you're completely missing simply because it wasn't caught in the beam, or maybe because it wasn't sitting next to something else that was important enough to catch the light.
It really makes you wonder if the conscious map we use to navigate our lives, to make decisions and plan our future, is inherently shaped and limited by the way our attention works.
Does that mean the world we're actually planning in isn't the full objective reality out there, but really just the version illuminated by our own unique, perhaps slightly fuzzy attentional spotlight?
And how does that fundamental constraint, that filtering process, shape every single decision we make? That's a deep thought to carry with you.